Hello and welcome to Scribes and Songsters. I'm Veronique Mandel. In this region of Ontario, most people have heard of the Underground Railroad. Stories or legend about the flight to freedom for many brave black freedom seekers. They were willing to risk life and limb to escape the horrors of enslavement in the United States. Who were these courageous people, and what has been their history here in our small part of the world? Well, there are few people more able to answer those questions, and many others, than my next guest. Milo Johnson is now a retired school teacher and is involved in researching and writing genealogy, local black history, and historical fiction. What's really important is that he can tell us so much about those freedom seekers who settled in Colchester and contributed so much to our culture and the economy. Welcome to Scribes and Songsters.
Thanks for having me here today.
There's so much in your books, and I have to say your research is absolutely extraordinary. And I want to get to the Colchester part, but there's so much that I want to ask you about first. Your book details in extraordinary detail the origins of slavery that was practiced by many ancient civilizations.
Right. And what people don't know is that slavery has existed throughout the world at different times through different ages. The types of slavery, not chattel slavery necessarily, but slavery nonetheless. Everything from ancient Roman times, the Greek times, the Egyptian times, and then further back, we had slavery. It speaks of it in the Bible. Extraordinary,
isn't it, how humans seem to want to rule other humans?
It seems like it's almost a natural thing that some people want to dominate other people, and they want to make their own lives easier by, using other people to do their work.
The African civilizations at the time, and I was just fascinating reading this, they were very advanced.
Yes, well, Lewis Henry Gates, and you've heard of him, right? I'm a fan of him. And I even studied that before his shows started coming on TV.
Yes.
So the Egyptian kingdom, for example, was taken over by the kingdom of Cush, which was just south of Egypt. So you've seen some black pharaohs. You've seen a picture of a black pharaoh? And that was a queen from Cush. And their kingdom was just as great. They had pyramids, they had monuments, and they had a very high-level society.
And they had sort of developments in metals and all sorts of things that today we never think about being in Africa.
Metallurgy was a big deal. Art and literature were huge. They traded in gold, all precious metals. Salt was a big commodity from the western part of sub-Saharan Africa. Mali was known for gold and salt. And then there was all these other kingdoms that I only heard about 4 of them. But once I started studying and trying to find out where my people came from, I wanted to know the truth about Africa. It wasn't the dark continent as so labeled by the European explorers. It was a fantastic place with great cultures. Yes, they clashed at times. One overtook the other.
Yeah.
But they were there nonetheless. They were kings and queens. As I say in one of my poems, we were kings and queens.
Yes, absolutely. So take us now to the United States. And one of the other things that you write about in your book is how highly skilled, even though these people were enslaved, they became very highly skilled. And in fact, they were tremendous contributors to the economy.
The American culture today was developed on slave labor, right? We know that. But what people don't know is that when they loaded the African people on the ships for the transatlantic Middle Passage, they were naked. They had very little clothes, no belongings, but they brought with them their culture, their skills, their art, their music, such as the banjo. their music, and their religions. And they had different religions, not just Christianity, but also the Muslim religion and other beliefs. So we call it the transference of culture across the Atlantic. They kept that within them. And when they got to the United States, of course, they still had that. So when they wanted to do things, they did it based on their cultures, even though there were more than 60 or 70 to 100 different cultures pushed onto, say, one farm or plantation, and they would develop their own so-called American culture.
It really is when you start delving into it and reading their stories. I mean, they were really extraordinary people. I mean, they were treated abominably, but you couldn't get away from the fact of who they were.
That's right. And because they weren't allowed to read and write, it was against the law, right? So they had what we call a griot, and that was a storyteller. That's an ancient African name for storyteller. And all of the stories and their histories were passed down orally by the griot. And a griot, their children became griots. They came from griots. So I have a friend, Lois Larkin. She's a griot in our community, and she does storytelling.
So what were some of the historical events that brought the freedom seekers here?
The first explorers were mainly the Portuguese. You know, we study in school, and it's very European-based study. Bartholomew Diaz and explorers like that. And one of my poems talks about what they discovered. They discovered black gold, and that was slavery. So that was the beginning. And because Spain and Portugal and the Dutch were coming across to the New World, what they called the New World, and to Brazil, Central America, North America, they brought slaves with them. And that transatlantic is called the Triangle, because they brought slaves to the New World. They had the slaves produce products, and the products went up to Europe, and then they came back down to Africa. The triangular economy.
So now you've got these large populations, and I think you write in your book there were millions.
Yes.
And events transpire, and you talk about some of the big events that took place in the United States that eventually saw them coming to the North.
Well, the War of Independence, that's what you're talking about?
Yes.
The War of Independence, the American patriots defeated the British, and the British had slaves. They were slaveholders. And one of the settlements for being defeated was that the Americans allowed the British to take their slaves with them when they left. So, especially in Nova Scotia, more so than anywhere, the east coast of Canada, you had British bringing their slaves with them. United Empire Loyalists, they call them. But also in our area, here in Essex County, they brought their slaves with them too.
Now, the Civil War in the United States, it would have been a very different war if the southern United States didn't depend on their black laborers to fight for them.
Right. So if some of the southern slave owners and their sons went to war, they usually took one of their slaves with them to help them out, right, to do the grunt work. And it is known that the slaves that were left behind, they are the ones that supported the southern economy because the owners and all the men were gone. So the slaves left behind carried on that economy. And
so we come to the freedom seekers who decided that they were going to get out of there. And tell me about their journey, those who came to Colchester. How did they choose this area? Do you know?
Yeah, it's hard to put your finger on it, but there's one thing we know. We called New Canaan because one of the things was music for people in bondage, enslaved. And that helped them work when they were singing, and it helped them work. They weren't singing because they were happy. They were singing to get through the drudgery of the day. They sang to praise God, right? It gave them a feeling of solace, like feeling good about themselves. And then they sang to send messages. And messages were sent through song. And that is one way that other enslaved people knew that, okay, there's going to be an escape. Right? Something's going to happen. And what we don't understand, too, is that not all slaves were on plantations. That's the movie media.
Yes.
You know what I mean? But there were slaves in all kinds of other occupations, in taverns and building railroads and ditches and fortifications and stuff like that. But yes, they chose, the term was the Promised Land. Right? Yeah. Canada, because it ended slavery in 1793, it ended the importation of slaves in 1793, but it didn't end slavery. And that law, if you really take a good look at it, it's kind of
murky.
Yeah, it's very murky. And then in 1833, even when Queen Victoria ended slavery in the British Empire, there were still people who had to serve out an apprenticeship for another 5 to 6 years. So we think of Canada as the Promised Land, and of course we called it New Canaan, and that's based on biblical terms of Moses getting the Israelites out of Egypt and finding the land of Canaan, which was their promised land. So in song, that's what happens. The freedom seekers sang about New Canaan, which was Canada. And I'm not going to trash Canada, but Canada had slavery too.
Oh, yeah. I mean, we can't just pretend that we didn't.
Yeah.
And so when they arrived, you list a bunch of places in the book where they settled in this area.
I have, and that I didn't know that in the beginning. Okay, so I'm in grade school. We do our social studies. I love the explorers. I didn't know at the time. And then when we got to doing our family tree, I'm like, I don't know where I came from. Right?
Yeah.
There's no history of us. We're not in the history books. We were not written about. So when I got to high school, I started going to family reunions, and I'm going, oh, so this is it. So I took that family reunion booklet and expanded it, and I ended up with a family genealogy book. Then I started researching the families, and I found out that there were all these family names. I have 92 in New Canaan Freedom Land. I researched 95, but I put 92 in the book, I think. And the stories are intriguing.
Absolutely. And I want to talk about some of them, but just let me see if I've got it tagged here. I was intrigued by the list. Like it wasn't just Amherstburg. But they settled everywhere, right?
Well, see, Amherstburg was one of the major stops because the first, the sailing vessels were bringing slaves up in their holds. They're hiding them. And the first port they came to was the Navy Yard at Amherstburg. Right? Because in the War of 1812, they built ships there, but they dropped off slaves there. Then they went up to Sandwich and Windsor. But the people who came to Windsor and Sandwich were coming up the Michigan side through Indiana, up through Michigan to Detroit, and then to Sandwich and Windsor. But these ships, which eventually were steamships, they were dropping off people at Amherstburg. So that's your entry point, right? And then they would send them inland because of slave catchers. There were slave catchers seen in different locations, Windsor, Amherstburg, Chatham. And so people would want to move further to the interior, and Colchester was the spot. So there were people tend to settle together because there's comfort in being together.
Yes.
And north of the village of Colchester was the glebe or church lands where they allowed freedom seekers to squat and have their little plots of land and raise stuff.
There was a place called Hopetown?
Hopetown is where my grandfather's farm was. They called it Hopetown because on an old map, it gave that this guy was trying to set up a new town before Harrow was made. And it was called Hopetown, and it centered around the 3rd concession and Drummond Road all the way to Walker Road. And he called that Hopetown.
And so your family history goes way back.
The first people in my family to come here was a guy named Joseph Green, and he fought in the War of 1812, and he got a grant of land. He was mixed race, and he got land in Malden and then in Colchester. That was around 1814. I found records of that. And of course, Gabriel Klingman, my 4th great-grandfather, came in 1820. And another guy named William Wilkes was the first ordained Black Baptist minister in Upper Canada. And he started his church in 1821 in Colchester, and it was called the African First Baptist Colchester Church.
How were people treated?
At first?
Yes.
In the beginning, of course, as in most cases, when we have immigration, in the beginning, a few are okay. And then if we go into a store, there's too many of them, right? So in Colchester, for example, by 1840, 1/3 of the population of the township of Colchester was Black. And I have documents that say we can't let them vote because there's too many of them. They might vote us out or vote a certain way.
Yeah, you're welcome, kind of, sort of.
Kind of, sort of, but keep your place.
Mm-hmm. And I understand that there was a greater population of Black residents then than now in this area.
Yes. So eventually, you're in a farming area, and most farm kids want to get out of there. I don't care what color you are,
exactly.
what nationality you're. I'm getting off this farm.
Yes.
Well, the opportunities for Blacks were even less than whites, right? So they would go to the cities or places of larger population. Windsor, Detroit, Ypsilanti was a big spot for them because that was part of the Underground Railroad.
Now, was it easy for them to go back to the U.S.?
Actually, in the beginning, Matthew Elliott, for example, he had 60 slaves on his farm south of Amherstburg. In 1807, 32 of his slaves escaped to the Michigan Territory, which was free land. It had no state status. And so he complained to the government, and he wanted compensation for the loss of his 32 slaves. There are things like that happened that we don't know about because it wasn't put into the history books. I mean, we have friends now that are doing that. Irene Moore.
Yes.
And Chris Carter, other people, they're noting all of this.
Because this is such a rich part of the history of this region.
Yes.
I mean, they were the early settlers in the same way as the people who came from...
They came at the same time.
Yeah.
So they established the village of Colchester, which they called the settlement. I forgot the name. The new settlement on the Lake Erie, right? And they planned out this village. They didn't plan for Blacks. They planned out this village mostly for United Empire Loyalists, and they gave out land grants accordingly along the lake, the front road, they called it. And so that was the first, I think, settlement in Upper Canada in this area was Colchester Village. Although Amherstburg existed, it was a garrison town to Fort Malden, right? Sandwich existed, Petitcoat, which is LaSalle, existed. Windsor came after Sandwich. Sandwich should have been the city, but because the railroad stopped in Windsor, so Sandwich dwindled, Windsor grew, Walkerville grew. So
as, they were here, as the years went by, they became more prosperous. And from what I've read in your books, Then they wanted more education, and
Oh boy.
I guess that didn't go well.
No, Egerton Ryerson, when he wrote the education plan first he wrote one in 1846, then he changed it, revised it in 1848, and then he revised it again in 1850. But he put a clause in that plan where there could be separate schools, because the government was very elitist, right? The legislature. There would be separate schools for Protestants, Catholics, and blacks.
When did that change? When did that get fixed?
The schools are segregated until it's a gradual desegregation. Some schools let blacks in earlier. I was just looking at this school, the Webb School. So there was a newspaper article in the old Amherstburg Echo, and it said, the Webb School in Colchester is building an addition for the colored children. Right? And if you look at Colchester School number 2, SS number 2, in the picture, you've got all of your white students and the teacher standing here. And then over off to the side are these 6 or 7, 8 black students. They couldn't even be in the same picture. But that gradually changed in the, I'd say, 1885 to 90s. It started being integrated.
Not before time.
Well, there were stipulations within the integration, like they draw a chalk line down the middle of the room. The blacks had to stay on one side, the whites on the other. That's Colchester. They couldn't hang their coats on the same side as the other kids. Their place to hang the coats was by the pot-bellied stove, and their lunches would get, overheated and so on, things like that. Yes.
So, sometimes it makes you think, perhaps in this area, we're too quick to say how bad the Americans were. I mean, we weren't all good in how we treated the black settlers.
I know, and I always say you can't paint everybody with the same brush.
Exactly.
Because there were good people amongst there. There were good white people among there, but usually the people in charge were not.
Mm-hmm. There were so many other people and no names in your book. Josiah Henson.
Yes. Josiah Henson lived in Colchester Township, near Colchester. From 1832, he brought 10 families with him from the Niagara region. They wanted to make a settlement, but they got some land. They were renting it from a guy named McCormick. I'm not going to say his first name. And he kind of finagled them, and he wouldn't sell them the land. He raised the price so high they couldn't buy the land. So Josiah Henson, of course, he lived there till 1841. Then he met this guy Fuller from who was British. He helped him fund and get funds and buy land near Dresden. So Josiah Henson moved his people from Colchester to Dresden.
I wondered how he got there. Yeah.
In the meantime, he fought, and he led the Black Battalion, the local black militia from Colchester and Malden. He led them in the Battle of the Schooner Ann during the 1837-1838 rebellion uprising.
Oh, wow. I didn't even know about that.
Right. So he writes about it in his book, that he helped capture the Schooner Ann, they were American patriots attacking Fort Malden and trying to take over.
Wow. And the Amherstburg Historical Museum, the Black Historical Museum, I think it's got another name now.
It's called the Amherstburg Freedom Museum.
Yes, great name. The real McCoy.
Oh, yes.
There were so many cool...
Elijah McCoy
yes.
was born just south of Harrow on Snake Lane, and he was born in 1843. His father escaped slavery with his wife and came to Colchester and became a well-known tobacconist because his father was the plantation owner and he learned to do tobacco. He had his freedom because he was the son of a plantation owner. But he escaped in the sense that his wife was a slave, so he had to have her escape with him to get her freedom. And they came up to Colchester. So Elijah McCoy in 1855 was sent to Scotland, and he got his engineering papers and degrees. And he came back, and of course he invented the oil lubricator for locomotives.
Yes, and forevermore, we always refer to things. We'll ask, is that the real McCoy?
Yeah, I want the real McCoy.
Yes, and I bet 8 out of 10 people wouldn't know where it came from.
That's right.
I didn't know until I went to the museum, and I was fascinated by how many things Black people invented that white people think they did.
Right.
Yeah.
Like the ironing board.
Yeah, and the vacuum.
And the water sprinkler, the lawn sprinkler, and so on. You can go on and on.
It is. It's quite extraordinary.
Right.
You were saying these illustrations in your books. These are beautiful illustrations.
The ones in the illustrations in my poetry
in your poetry books.
They're all done by my niece, Miriam Wilson. Right now she's working at Shoppers and Herald. But Miriam, she was in our art show. She does all kinds of art. She's self-taught and she's prolific.
Her work is really beautiful. Right. What do you want people to take away from your books?
I wrote the book because I was doing my family genealogy. And when I was doing that, I found all these other stories about other Black families in Colchester. And I was like, I was blown away. So when I started looking at it, I went, oh, here's a really good one. This is how they got here. Some people came as free Blacks. Some escaped, lived in another state like Indiana. Indiana passed Black codes and Black laws where they had to register, so they left, like the McCurdy's. And they came up to Canada.
I can't tell you how much I've enjoyed this. Thank you so much for sharing all of those wonderful stories. Where can people buy your book?
My book is on sale at Ayers and Harrow. That's in the Harrow Arena. Yeah. And at the Freedom Museum, they do most of my sales.
Thank you so much. Well, that's all for this episode of Scribes and Songsters. Many, many thanks to our wonderful guest, Edward Milo Johnson. Thanks to our Scribes and Songsters team, producer Liz Pettipies-Phillips, technical producer and editor Gary Glass, social media manager Michelle Fortier, and producer consultant Brian Sweet. Grateful thanks to Tony Toldo and the Toldo Foundation, and to Neil and Tina Queering for their support. Thank you for watching. I hope to see you soon, right back here on Scribes and Songsters. I'm Veronique Mandel. Bye for now.